Hi, thanks for joining me again here on the Traveling in Ireland podcast. I'm back this week with it's actually two questions, one from a podcast listener and one from a reader of my website, but both have to do with the same topic, and that is what happens in the US after you clear customs in Ireland. And this is a question I actually receive a lot. I can't believe I haven't really thought about doing a podcast episode about it until now, but there you have it. Um, so I'm going to kind of go over this with you a little bit, the things that you can expect uh, clearing customs in Ireland, arriving into the US. But if there's a scenario that maybe you can think of that I've missed or another question, I would love to hear it. So be sure to hang around till the very end so you can get information on how you can send me your questions as well. So, when you fly direct from Ireland to the US via Dublin Airport or Shannon Airport, you will clear US Customs in Ireland. Now, I go over the process for both of those in the Dublin Airport tips for arrivals and departures and the Shannon Airport tips for arrivals and departures. Those are both full articles on my website. So if you want those, go ahead and click through to the show notes and you will be able to get the links for those right at the beginning of the show notes, and you can take a look at the information for the airport that you are using. Now, at this time, those are the only two airports in Ireland that you can fly direct to the US on return. So let's talk about what you can expect when you arrive back in the US after clearing customs in Ireland. So Jim S. emailed me with this scenario. He said, I'll be flying out of Shannon, which I believe should allow me to clear customs in advance, direct flight to Newark on United Airlines. I've read two different things that seem to conflict. I've read on the Shannon website that once you pre-clear in Ireland, your flight will arrive in the US as though it were a domestic flight. I also read on the Newark Airport website that all international flights will arrive and they have to claim their bags, go through customs, and then return their bags for the next flight. I'm worried that they don't make a distinction for flights from Shannon and just lump them in as any other international flight. If I have to go through customs at Newark, I won't have time to make my connection. Do you have specific knowledge of this scenario? Now, I don't have specific knowledge of Newark itself. However, Ireland is, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this, but Ireland is the only place that I know of internationally that you can clear U.S. customs before leaving the country. If there are others, I would love to know, but right now the only ones I know of are Ireland. And you do, in fact, arrive as though you were arriving from a domestic flight. Now, the reason that the airlines will say all international flights is because it's very rare for you to be able to clear customs outside of the U.S. So, you will clear customs in Shannon or Dublin, and he will arrive in Newark as a domestic flight. Now, because he's flying on United, he'll arrive in Terminal C, which handles both domestic and international flights for that airline. So what I would say is check where you're coming into. I'm going to talk about one airport in particular in just a couple of minutes, but check where you're coming into. If you're flying on United, American, Delta, they most likely have a terminal that handles all of their flights. You will arrive as though you came in from a domestic flight. Now, because you cleared customs in Ireland, you don't need to retrieve your bags. And a little caveat on this is provided that your flights are booked on a single ticket, which means the connecting flights are booked at the same time with a layover in between. You didn't book one leg of a flight and then another leg of a flight. So your bags, provided your flights are on a single ticket, will be transferred to the connecting flight. You will land and you will walk to your next gate. Now, I recommend a minimum of 2 hours between connecting flights just in case of flight delays. Airlines will make recommendations when you're booking that full trip, let's say you have a layover in Newark, they may make a recommendation of a flight connection that is 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I think that's a little tight because, again, they're looking at it as though it's a domestic flight. They know you do not have to clear customs when you arrive, so they aren't giving you that extra time. But I recommend a minimum of 2 hours just in case of flight delays. If that connection is under 60 minutes, I personally wouldn't book it. 90 minutes should be doable, but I do recommend 2 hours. Just as an example, when I returned from Ireland in October, I was booked on the later flight. So I fly into Chicago. I could have done my flight was set to arrive just after 2. My connecting flight was, the first one was shortly before 4 p.m., so just under 2 hours. And had there been any flight delays, which there had been the last few days, I knew that I wouldn't make that connection. And I also know that the last flight of the day out of Chicago to my home airport is always full. So what I did was I booked that very last flight out, which gave me a stupidly long layover. It was close to 7 hours. But when I landed and I knew I could make that flight, I went to an American Airlines desk and I just requested that I be put on standby for the earlier flight. And I was the first one on standby. I made the earlier flight and I made it home. But that way I knew I was guaranteed on the later flight, which I knew that if I had missed the earlier flight, I probably wasn't going to get on it. And then I'd be stuck in Chicago overnight and need a hotel because it was my fault that I missed the earlier flight. So that's kind of why I err on the side of caution on my layovers coming back internationally. Now, Patrice W. had another question about clearing customs, and she said, if I'm reading this correctly, when I land in Boston on my layover on my way home to Charlotte, I will not need to pick up my bags and recheck them. I want to buy some whiskey duty-free, and on previous trips to Europe, I had to put them in my checked bag before I rechecked them. And so what Patrice is understanding correctly is that she will not be retrieving her bags. So she won't be able to put that duty-free whiskey into a checked bag. She won't have access to it because if her tickets were booked on a single ticket, and this is just a layover, she won't get her bags back. So what she will do, and this is actually good information for anything, whatever you buy in the airport is like a free carry-on. So when you buy duty-free in Ireland and you carry it onto the plane, that does not count against your carry-on your carry-on allowance. And so when you arrive in the US, let's say at Boston, and you have this carry-on that you purchased at duty-free in Dublin, it can go right on the next flight with you. You're not passing through security. You're not needing to check that because it was purchased in an airport. It is a carry-on item that does not count against your carry-on allowance, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Now, the one thing I do want to say is you need to check how the flights come into that airport. I haven't flown into Boston in a long time, so what I recommended for her was checking the terminal that the flight arrives into and the terminal that her next flight will go out from. If you can stay behind security between terminals, then that will work. Now, if you can't stay behind security between terminals, then you're going to have a problem. Like I said, the airport that I go in and out of is Chicago. And usually I fly out of my smaller airport to Chicago and then go to Ireland from Chicago. And Chicago is kind of a weird little beast because even though Aer Lingus, let's say Aer Lingus, arrives into Chicago as a domestic flight, because you have to take the train to get between the terminals. Terminal 5, which is Chicago, is a separate terminal and not walkable from the domestic terminals. So, or all the domestic terminals but Delta. Just a caveat there right now. So I actually have to exit security to get onto the train to go to the correct terminal and go back through security to get to my flight. And in that case, carrying a duty-free whiskey probably isn't going to go through security in Chicago because it's over the limit. Now, I've not tested this. It's in the duty-free bag. It's still sealed, but I kind of think it's going to depend on your agent. So double check where your terminals are and if you are going to have to pass through security again. If you have to pass through security again, that duty-free item, if it's whiskey, may not make it through that second security check between terminals. So just check that before you do any duty-free carry-ons when you do have a layover. So I hope that the answers to those two questions have helped you to understand what's going to happen when you arrive back in the U.S. after clearing customs in Ireland. So do you have an Ireland travel question or a comment to make about this one? You can always leave a comment on the show notes page. There is a section for comments at the very bottom. Otherwise, you can email your questions to me, Jody, Jody, at IrelandFamilyVacations.com. Just write podcast question in the subject line, or you can message me on Instagram or Facebook at Ireland Family Vacations. Don't forget to let me know how I can give you a shout out to thank you for sending in your question. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, Slán go fóill.